Um, I appreciate everybody's attendance tonight. I can't believe Dan and Steve asked me to come back. If
It's
you
all,
don't like the presentation, I would. What's that?
it's
Oh,
all Steve's fault.
yeah, absolutely. I was going to say I would totally blame Steve Waterman for any type of deficiencies that you see this evening.
Yes.
But he did come to me and he said, "Hey, what can you talk about?" And I said, "Well, I think there's one topic that's probably unique that hasn't been talked about, and there's not a lot of people to talk about it." So I said, let's talk about some interoperable communications from air to ground resources, specifically with emergency management. And obviously, we've seen a lot of that in the news, and I'll show you a lot of pictures. But uh, I am coming to you kind of representing a multiple agencies. One of them is the state of North Carolina Emergency Management. The other one is the healthcare system in North Carolina and the Air Medical Service and all those wheels that it takes to get all this done. I don't like to talk a lot about myself, but I am, those of you that don't know me, I am an amateur radio operator. I'm a retired fireman and paramedic, and now I work for a healthcare coalition in a large regional healthcare system. And I oversee a bunch of radio systems, everything from trunk P25 to DMR and analog. And I just so happened to fall into helping one of the chief pilots in North Carolina with programming, and it kind of just went from there. And next thing I know, I'm handling a majority of the aircraft in the state with the programming, and I help a lot of neighboring states and states across the country. So it's worked out. It's a nice little niche to have, and it's a lot of fun. And of course, I serve on a bunch of committees across the nation, everything from encryption to some healthcare groups. All right, so everything tonight, sometimes it gets a little touchy with this stuff. Everything tonight is TLP white, and if those of you hopefully are familiar with that, and everything can be shared that you'll see tonight. There's no pictures or information that is secure. All right, so the traffic light protocol, if you don't know, it's adopted by CISA. There's many different forms of it as far as what it looks like and pictures and descriptions, but this is just a real basic. And if you're not familiar, you can look at here and kind of give you an idea which, this is really good. So if you do any documents and you do training classes or you do anything like that, this is really good to mark this stuff because if you don't mark it once it gets out in the hands, it's hard to take that back, and it's easy to understand. Hopefully, everybody understands how to drive. All right, so what we're going to talk about is I didn't miss a slide there. Yep, nope. What we're going to talk about tonight is a variety of things, and I'll let it pop up there. We're going to talk about North Carolina. North Carolina is unique for a few different reasons. And we're going to talk about why air to ground communications is really important. And we don't think about it a whole lot. And when we think of air communications, most of us probably take commercial flights, and the FAA and the air traffic system works pretty flawlessly from day to day. And we're going to talk about some of the tools that are available now. Things have changed, from over the last 30 years and how we conduct business. And we're going to talk about trunked radio systems and using them in the air. And it's kind of a new, I want to say it's new, but it's gaining traction with in the search and rescue business on board aircraft. And we're going to talk about use cases in North Carolina. So everything we're going to talk about tonight, how do we use it? What are some things that's worked really well on? And what are some pitfalls that you may want to avoid? Some of you listening may be involved with your state emergency management and have a hand in aviation. And things tonight, if at the end of the presentation, my contact will be up there. My overall goal is to provide everybody this information, but also for somebody to take it back and advance their communications as it relates to aviation. All right, so in North Carolina is a busy place. So we hate to say it's hurricane season coming up. I think I looked last, it was 97 days away. And we get a lot of hurricanes here. And we're kind of unique. The geographic location, North Carolina, is sticking out in the ocean, and we have the Outer Banks, and we have a lot of challenges that we have to work through. So, as many of you in different parts of the country have different natural events, ours just happens to be hurricane. So we kind of combine a lot of things in one. There is we have obviously the marine environment and the ocean. We have the lowlands, and we have the mountains. And believe it or not, we have people that get flooded out on top of a mountain. So we have a little bit of everything. And here's just some statistics, but our hot time is for storms is anywhere from around July through October or so. And knock on wood, we have not had any big storms over the last few years. And when I say big, I'm talking Hurricane Sandy, Harvey, those big impact storms. All right, so some memorable images. Probably everybody remembers looking on TV and seeing Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey. So those that were in Texas, and just the amount of, if I remember correctly, it was like 30 something inches of rain, and it's just the storm stalled out, and tremendous amount of air rescues being conducted. And then Hurricane Maria, that's a different type of storm. We're going to talk about that. Of course, that was Puerto Rico. And but when we looked at these pictures on the nightly news, we saw the typical picture you see here in the Coast Guard, and they're just a fantastic group, and we'll talk a lot about them. But people are evacuating up to their attics and the rooftops, and they're cutting holes in their roofs, and they're sitting on the roofs waiting to be rescued. So that's a multi-problem there. One is evacuating people ahead of that, because logistically trying to do that large amount of rescue from the air is very difficult. But if you can think about all of the ground agencies, so when you have a big incident like this, if you can imagine all of the different types of local, regional, state, and national agencies that show up, and the amount of different types of radio technology they use, and then how do the aircraft communicate with all those resources on the ground. And it gets super complicated. It really does. So we're gonna hit on that a lot. All right. So where are we in the aviation communication world? Where are we? And what you see up top is the famous KX 170 or 175 radio. This is your typical AM air radio, been used for many years, and they've been replaced obviously by newer radios, but probably everybody is familiar with a handheld radio, and you see that in the top middle. And of course, our aviation tower controllers do a fantastic job of daily basis mitigating all of the traffic. And when we look at AM radio technology, it's it's old, but it's reliable. But now let's take a step down on the next line, and what we see is a TDFM 9000 series, and that radio you're looking at there on the left, usually, and just ballpark, they're anywhere from $60,000 to $80,000. What you see on the bottom, TDFM 9000 series, these are the newer radios that are installed in the aircraft, and they are all band. So we're talking VHF, UHF, 700-800 megahertz, and it could be a variety of other things, but they are obviously AM, FM, and we'll do P25, we'll do trunking, and we'll do encryption. AES 256, OTAR, I mean, everything out there, these radios will do. And you can notice here, most of these aircraft have switched over to glass cockpits, and it's very streamlined. And there's a lot of equipment in these aircraft now. All right, so real quick, we're going to just review the Viper system in North Carolina. And every state has their state-run uh, radio system, and ours happens to be Viper, which stands for Voice Interoperability Plan for Emergency Responders. And as of today, we're going to go through, I think we're up to about 160,000 users or so right now. And this gives you an idea. If you look at the state of North Carolina, all the red dots, and there's been more since then, are tower sites. So you can go from one side of the state all the way to the other. What makes this really good is that every hospital in North Carolina has their own Viper medical talk group. So when we start talking about interfacility transports with aircraft and search and rescue stuff, helicopters can easily communicate with the hospitals that they're transporting patients to. But this is a little bit older information, but we were up to 223 sites, and the full build out was around 241. And we have about 450 PSAPs that are tied into, or communication centers, some of them are not PSAPs, that are tied into the core directly. And the average push to talk count is about 288,000, and the monthly average is 8,500,000. So that's a lot of times of pushing the button. So there's a lot of traffic across the system. And like I said, I think we're up to about 160,000 users now. What's really good about the system is that we get a lot of flooding here. And we'll talk about the different types of storms we get, but flooding is a big one. And a lot of times your local backhaul or service providers may go down. Most of these sites are all backhauled on microwave. And as long as the generator maintains power to the sites, there's times nothing worked except for Viper radio because it continued to work and the backhaul was all microwave. Now there's some downfalls to that too, and we'll talk about when we get large wind events that it can be a downfall. And the tower you see on the right, these are a typical tower you see freestanding, about 340, 350 feet. And they have microwave dishes up, a primary and a secondary link for each path. And that's a pretty common picture of what sites look like. So how does it work? And it's really, the radios in the helicopter are really no different than the portable radio that the firefighter is using out on the ground. And those of you that are not familiar with the trunked radio system, trunking goes back pretty far, but it's really a computer-aided radio network. And just like a telephone number, your radio has a specific number attached to it, and that's how the system identifies it, determine what talk group it's supposed to be on. And that radio is continuously handshaking with the system. So even though you're not pushing that transmit button every time you turn the radio on, turn it off, switch channels, and some other things, that is handshaking with the system and letting the system know what you're doing. And this is a typical site that you see. This will be a pretty small site, 4 or 5 channel site with GTR repeaters at the tower. And many of you all have the same type of equipment for systems locally and probably across your state. But you can take the word Viper out here and you can replace it with whatever your state system is. So in South Carolina, it could be the PAL 8 system. In Mississippi, it could be the MISWIN system, or TACAN for Tennessee. The point of this is that it's just another tool in the toolbox. So if we look at all of the resources on board the aircraft, so we have Aviation, Victor and Uniform, or VHF and UHF, Marine VHF, National Public Safety Frequencies, UHF. Some of the aircraft have satellite, HFL, ALE on some of them, and of course Viper, and then independent systems, as they go towards more populated areas. But the point is, it's another tool in the toolbox, and not any one of these tools is perfect. So they're each have a pro and a con. All right, so one thing we are proud of is that all of the daily medical operations across North Carolina, and we have a lot of helicopters. So my agency in particular has 5, and most of these level 1 trauma centers across the state have that and more. So we're talking a lot of helicopters. I'm just ballpark, maybe 30 to 40 helicopter EMS platforms. So they conduct daily operations, so flight following and patient reporting and all that. They are using the state 800 megahertz trunk system daily for that. So every one of these aircraft you see are equipped with one of a few radios that we'll cover real quick towards the end of the presentation. But border states, so Tennessee, Virginia, South Carolina, same thing. We share the radio system with them. They come into North Carolina. They still have access to all the hospitals. And instead of being on simplex, where you're calling in a patient report to a hospital, they can be, technically across the other side of the state if they wanted to and call the hospital. The other thing is all search and rescue aircraft in North Carolina have Viper on board. So that includes Air National Guard UH-60s, LUH-72s, and of course, Civil Air Patrol. And so we're pretty proud. Anything related to search and rescue, for the most part, has Viper capable radios on board. Here's a picture of some of the other aircraft that we see from time to time in North Carolina. We have UH-60s. I think we have, I'm not sure exact number. I want to say it's about 10 or 12 that are actually on Viper and registered with Viper. The lighter helicopter, LUH-72s, we have, last I knew, we had 4 of those. CH-47s come from South Carolina, and we're happy to load Viper in them if they come over and have to work over here. We get a lot of Coast Guard aircraft. So what you see on the top right, the HH-65 and the MH-60, the yellow one down below, which is the Centennial colors. Those, we have Air Station Elizabeth City in North Carolina, and they cover a wide area out on the coast, all the way up into Maryland, down to, and they butt up with Savannah Air Station. And they are very busy, and we'll talk a lot about them. We have a highway patrol here, some 407 aircraft, and they got some newer ones that are coming in. And then, believe it or not, when things get bad, and the hurricane in Florida, the last one, I can't recall the name of it, Border Patrol, they bring some aircraft in, helicopters and some fixed wing aircraft to provide some support. And very interesting, the resources they provide. And you can obviously tell by the antenna on the aircraft that that is not a normal aircraft. So it's definitely made for helping communications. So 2 of the main U.S. Coast Guard resources we have here is Sector, which is in Wilmington, North Carolina, and that is mainly the Marine or ground command and control coordination point for the sector. So all the boats and cutters and all that type stuff, that's where that's being coordinated out of. And then we have the air station that's up in Elizabeth City. And you can see that on the right. And normally we have 4 MH-60 aircraft there, and then they have a variety of C-130 aircraft. And believe it or not, they fly all the way up into Newfoundland and up in the Northeast, doing iceberg patrols all the way from North Carolina. So we're pretty blessed to have them here. All right, one thing that's important is, if you can imagine having all these resources, is trying to make sure everybody has the correct things loaded in the aircraft, on the ground, making sure we call channels the same thing. So, if you're calling channel 1 ITAC 50 and I'm calling it UTAC something else, that could really be a problem. So we do have a standardized template. So if you're on the state radio system, you have to have this standardized template as a minimum to put in your radios. That way we're talking all the same channels and we have the same capability, and we can of course add on to that with our our local stuff. And we have some guidance in there on encryption and programming authority and how we use state event talk groups during disasters. One interesting thing, speaking of that, is when we do have rescues or there are aircraft doing hoist and things like that, is what does everybody want to do? Is let's say they're operating on a specific channel, the aircraft and the crews below is sandbagging, is listening, is, hey, I'm over here on the other part of the state, but I want to hear what's going on over there on the east. I'm gonna turn my radio on and listen. So we do have some difficulties as with any system of resource management. And occasionally we have to geographically isolate some of those things because there's a lot. If you imagine those 160,000 users trying to listen to a rescue that's happening on the other side of the state, it's just using a lot of resources. But here, the way it works, if we do it perfectly, is we can have rescues occurring, all over the state. And at our state EOC, we have the air cell and an air boss, and that air boss is coordinating all those aircraft and resources. And they could be across the state anywhere, and they can all talk with each other, which is really good. In the conventional world, and we'll talk about some of the other incidents like Harvey, that became very difficult. And we've had a lot of good success with hurricanes. We've had Florence and some of the other big ones where we've had significant flooding. Viper was a real win for us. All right, some really, don't want to get too technical, but LMR, or the state trunked radio system, is LMR, and it's designed for radios that are really on the ground, and it's just like your cell phone. And if you look at how those antennas are on the tower and how that radiates is, of course, horizontally, and some of those antennas have down tilt and push that signal towards the ground. So obviously you can imagine being high where that is not advantageous for a good signal. Luckily, most of the helicopters fly below generally 5,000 feet, most of the time even 2,000, 3,000 feet at most. And signals actually do really well below 3,500 feet. So the helicopters have pretty good performance. And there's a few pitfalls that you have to be aware of when you're programming. But we've had aircraft go all the way out to about 100 miles offshore and can still communicate back. And it's been very convenient. We have loaded C-130s, and as long as they fly low, they'll work. Once they get high, you can imagine, up here where, let's just say 10,000 feet, that's not very high for a fixed wing aircraft that size. And they're out. They can't do it. The really cool part is that the same equipment is on board 90% of all the Coast Guard aircraft. It's the same. So the same RT or radio module that's on board that helicopter you see there is the same exact one that is on board that C-130. It's the same feature set, the same flash code. It's very, one thing the Coast Guard has done a fantastic job with is standardization. And nobody can rival what they've done with that. So it's very easy to program from a programmer standpoint. Is we can make a code plug and just adjust IDs, and it works well. All right, so here's one of the problems we do have is when we have aircraft using LMR radio systems, is a lot of times that aircraft, because of its height, holds on to a tower site or a control channel much longer than it should. So you see the tower sites that are closer to the bottom of the helicopter there. Obviously, the one directly below it is in a null area, but we have some other ones that, and RSSI stands for Received Signal Strength Indicator. We could see this one's here, 112, 80, but no, this one is still locked on one that's probably 70 miles away. That is 48, which is pretty marginal. So that is something we do have to deal with a lot of times. And having that height advantage actually becomes a challenge occasionally. All right, there's other aircraft. We talked about the Border Patrol aircraft. They do a thing in the event all the communications is busted in that red circle. They'll do much like what the Coast Guard does is they'll do a hybrid mission and fly an aircraft high above everything and assist with command and control, down below. And that's another problem. So when we start looking at an aircraft flying at 10,000 feet, if you simply look out the window, your line of sight distance could be up to 125 miles. That doesn't count the horizon or the radio horizon. So can you imagine trying to light up a repeater, just a conventional repeater? Just think of it as a ham repeater or a, public safety conventional repeater at 10,000 feet. What are some of the problems? And yes, you guessed it, is you don't light one up, you light 10 up. And so we have to be very careful once you start coordinating aircraft that high. It essentially comes down to line of sight or simplex communications because, repeaters, especially some of the public safety ACAL, ATAC repeaters, they're used many times over that geographic region. So you'll be lighting a bunch of them up. So a lot of coordination with that. All right, so let's talk about a few uses and scenarios of where this type of technology works and where it doesn't. So Hurricane Harvey, August 2017. This, if everybody remembers, I do, because the first thing I was thinking about was the air assets. But, this still was a strong hurricane, but what happened is it came into Texas, it stalled and literally just dumped rain for, at least 24 hours. And it was a different type of storm that we're accustomed to. And the biggest one here is that cellular infrastructure really worked well. And of course, there was some outages and degradations, but if you looked here at the disaster area on the right, and we look at the percentage of cell that was out, it was pretty low. And that really speaks a lot about the resiliency of our cellular network. And what we started seeing was people reporting that they were trapped, needed rescue, they were out of medicine, all the things that go wrong in a disaster. They couldn't get through to 911, and they were posting this stuff to social media, or they're on Twitter. Help me! I'm at this location. I'm stuck in my house. I can't get out. So this really was an eye opener for the public safety community. Is wow, maybe our 911 system hasn't kept up with technology. So folks are reporting they need help to social media, but that shouldn't be. And we look at the center there, and they received over 75,000 calls in 24 hours. Can you imagine how busy that was? So let's look at all that and the technology. So here you have victims that are on the ground. They have a cell phone. They have somehow reported that they need help, and some of them are marked based upon their geolocation. So how do we deal with that information? And the reality is we weren't prepared. And not just Texas, but us as a nation. So a lot of aircraft came into Texas to help. I want to say there probably was at least 80 aircraft of all different types. So State Air National Guard, forestry, federal assets, Title 10. I mean, it's all this stuff came in. So can you imagine the comm challenge there? And not only having interoperable channels, but the ability to load them if you need to. I mean, it gets so complicated. The one thing they do have, though, that works perfect is their air or AM air communications. They do that daily. Every aircraft has it. So that part, obviously works well for air-to-air coordination. It's the air-to-ground that got really sticky. So here in North Carolina, we sent some teams, and sure enough, we sent some Black Hawks down there and some Swiftwater and urban search and rescue resources. And when they get there, what happens? No comms on the air-to-ground side. They literally were using a cellular telephone to report things and complete their assignments. And like I said, cellular worked really well. But those of you that are not familiar, the NIFOG that's pictured in the center of the screen, and I'll put a QR code up there later. And even though we're all amateur radio operators and all of this is public safety, the deal is this book here, no matter if you're from North Carolina or California, if you have this book, we should not be without communications. So no matter what radio band you have, if you have the things loaded in this book, we should be able to communicate fairly well. And we still find challenges with that. All right, so let's talk about a different scenario. This is Hurricane Maria. And this was a little bit different. So the last one was a high water event. This high wind event. So highest wind speed, 175 miles an hour. This is a little bit different storm. And this is going to dictate a little bit different technology that's used. So again, we look on the left, we see Hurricane Harvey with the amount of cellular infrastructure that was impacted. And then we look on the right. So if you can see the color codes at the bottom, the light colors, the blues, the yellows, that's down in the 20% or so. But this red, this dark color red you see on the right, that's 81 to 100% of sites that are out, broken. So those same towers that all that cellular infrastructure is sitting on, the radio systems that are sitting on similar towers, what do you think happened to them? And that's right, it's the same type outcome. They were damaged. So those two different scenarios really is going to dictate the different types of tools we use in that toolbox. And I like posting this picture during trainings that we do. How dependent is our society on communications now? And really, if you take two things away, communications or power, people panic. And here, this was actually in Puerto Rico. You can see that, people were not able to make a phone call. So they thought, well, if I walk to the tower, maybe it's my signal that's bad. I don't know maybe it'll get better. And we essentially have zombies all walking towards the tower site here. And if you look at the tower site, you can see some of the air arrays are hanging off, and it's probably dead. But my point is that society has become so dependent on especially cellular infrastructure. All right, some other things we have, and most people don't relate HF to aircraft. But the aircraft you see down on the bottom middle, this is the old towel rack or towel bar HF antenna, and you will see this a lot on the UH-60 platforms. You'll see it on the Coast Guard, all the 65 and UH-60, MH-60 aircraft. So all those larger aircraft, most of them have the capability of HF ALE on board. And if you do ALE, and that's absolutely great. Here in North Carolina, we're very big on WinLink, and using currently we're with the shares program, and we're very, very happy with that resource. Working through some challenges, but it's very, very beneficial to us. So all of the state emergency management branch offices have it. And of course, the level 1 trauma center you see here up in the top middle, we have it as well. But that is a capability. So when you may not think about talking to aircraft on HF, but that is a possibility. And we do have that in our channel lineup that I'll show you here shortly. And if you look at the eastern part of North Carolina, we do have RMS or WinLink gateway stations that are scattered. We're a little bit inland here, where you see above the this little map diagram here, the H to the right of North Carolina. That's where I am here. We have it at Dare County EOC on the Outer Banks, and we have another one down here in Wilmington, right on the coast. So it is convenient for this. All right, so hopefully this won't bore you, but I figured it would be fun to at least show you the type of equipment that is on board the aircraft. And this brand here, and there's really two major brands, and it's Wolfsburg and Technosonic. And the ones you see here is a RT7000 on the left, and that is the newer radio. And you see an RT5000, which is still very popular, on the right-hand side. And like I said, these are all it depends how they're configured, but most of them will do all bands across the board. Most of the Air National Guard resources across the country are all standardized. So the LUH and the UH 60s, most of them are standardized. So you see some of them have Wolfsburg and some have Technosonic. But how it's designed, the radio sits in the back of the aircraft, and you can see the cabling. Antennas connect to the RT that you see, the radio. And then you have a head of some kind that's up in the front that obviously you can punch in channel numbers and things of that nature. All right, this is another example. So Coast Guard does a little bit different. What you see is an RT5000, and they don't have a head like most other aircraft out there. They feed it into a flight computer, which is something which you see on the right. And when it comes to P25 trunking, what's really unique is they take the guts of a portable radio, and you see that on the left. And the older radios, it was an XTS 5000. And the newer ones, obviously, it's a Motorola Apex radio. And that is essentially what's inside of the radio that accomplishes the trunking portion. So it's really a hybrid of technology inside those RT modules. And here's a picture of the Technosonic. This one, what's a little bit different about this one, you saw the separate RT module and the separate head. This one is all self-contained in one box. So it is a little more convenient because you don't need multiple programming options, and it's all self-contained there. But if we look at this radio in the picture, they have multiple. So really, they have 4 different options for radios there. So all they do is they select on the radio that they want, and they still have all the other ones up there for. So really, they have 4 radios sitting on that deck, and that's pretty neat. And most of the time, that does not include their AM air. So obviously, they can do their AM air or Victor communication on that radio, but most of them have a separate standalone radio for that. So that's even more radios in addition to that. And of course, HF would be completely separate. And then SATCOM would be separate from that. So some of these aircraft may have 8, 9 different types of radio technologies on board. Another interesting thing is they can most of them can cross band repeat. So if they go up and are circling overhead, they can actually pull in radio traffic from one band and can repeat it out from on board the aircraft, flying overhead. And that's another cool thing. All right, so here you see the NIFOG that's posted up here, and you see the AUXFOG, which I believe there's an update coming out to that. The NIFOG 2.0 is somewhat new, and these QR codes should work here at the bottom. If you don't have either one of those, I definitely recommend that needs to be in your toolbox. And excellent document. And I know some of you that I've seen on the call probably contributed to both of those documents. So they're outstanding. All right, so we talked about this earlier, and we're just going to dig a little bit more into it, is when we start thinking about strategy on those 2 different types of storms that are coming. The first one was actually, and it's a little backwards here, but was a high water event. From a system standpoint, a lot of the challenges we look at with that is access being cut off to the sites and refueling. And that becomes a challenge if you look at the picture on the bottom there with wide area flooding, is how do we get fuel to those tower sites once they've been running for a few days? And here, the TSU, the Technical Services Unit for Viper, they just do a fantastic job. I mean, they're great, and they manage to get the job done one way or the other. But when we start talking about high water or a flooding event, we generally think communications are going to be okay. We may lose internet connectivity, or a CO may go out or underwater, and phones may go down. But overall, if we look at all the storms we've had over the last 10 years, it's been very good with infrastructure. Is most of the cell stuff has stayed up, most of our radio infrastructure has stayed up, and those are those type technologies we're going to leverage. When we look at the other side, though, that high wind event, now we have a different problem. Is now all those microwave dishes that we see on the tower, and backhaul issues, and of course damage to towers. Then we start looking is, hey, so that's that Hurricane Maria scenario, and we start looking at different types of technology as what we're going to use, and that can be direct or simplex, the HF, that all that stuff is what we start looking at, because we're worried that infrastructure is going to be broken. And obviously that's a much longer recovery time to get that fixed. When we have towers or microwave dishes that get damaged, those aren't just simple 1 hour fixes most of the time. All right, so here's some lessons learned. And, as we do this more, obviously we get better at it. But most of the time when we're starting to pick people off of roofs, or they're doing lots of rescues, is that, from a aviator standpoint, they're trying to get the most amount of people out of a bad situation into a safe spot. So that gets complicated when we start dealing with patient movement, or people that actually need medical care. And sometimes the closest spot may not be the best thing for the patient. So we have to do this continual balance of how do we affect the most amount of rescues and take care of the people that are sick and injured. And, we call that triage, but it gets a little bit harder when we start bringing them up into helicopters. So something we've done here over the last few storms is we include a subject matter expert from the healthcare side that's also communication based or oriented. And that way, that air boss or the air cell, they can get some good information from those people about, hey, what hospital is still, accepting patients, which ones are not on generator, or, which ones are evacuating, all that type stuff. And if you look at the chart on the bottom, this is what we call essential elements of information. These are all the things that we look at when we look at a hospital, and we base upon, where patients need to go or patient movement. These are all the things we look at. And so, communication infrastructure, what their capacity is, how much food do they have power, do they have commercial water, all that type of stuff. And so there's a lot that goes into trying to figure out where people need to go. Sometimes we've done really well with that, other times not so much. The other thing is all those air medical services that you saw, they're normally flying every day. And once that weather goes bad, or once it gets to an unacceptable flight status, they essentially park. And now other resources take over. So what you see on the bottom right is a Coast Guard MH-60 that was actually taking off. I believe this was down in New Hanover in Wilmington, North Carolina, really in the storm. Okay. And I forget the scenario, what type of patient or rescue they had, but Coast Guard, like I said, they're just amazing, but you could see the weather's very bad, and they were bringing patients in. But one thing that's another challenge, and this is for people involved, is not all care is the same on all these aircraft. So once all the air medical stuff goes out of service, and then we start using DoD resources or different types of resources, you know, we're used to flying with a flight nurse, a paramedic, and a pilot. Now you may have a rescue swimmer, a pilot, and, a medic. And in the military, a medic has all different types of meanings. So so once we have patients that may be on IV pumps or, being transported from one facility to another, then we have a whole nother issue we have to look at is the manpower that has to accompany all that. All right, so we don't have much longer. I know we're going close to an hour here. I think there's a few more slides left. We're on 3440. This is how we conduct business on a day-to-day basis. And so all these aircraft, most of the air medical services take care of themselves, but with the national or federal or DoD assets that have Viper, the way we work it is all the avionics technicians, they regularly touch those aircraft. And we try to not have to touch the aircraft. One is it's a very expensive piece of equipment, and it's not ours. So we let the experts that know how to do that. We just assist them with the programming. So they may have aircraft that come in and go out for maintenance and other issues. So they send us the loads that are in there. We modify them, send them back, and then they walk out and push them in, ops check them, and good to go. So you remember, it's a little more than just programming a frequency. So these are trunked radios, so they have to have IDs. We have to coordinate that in a database to the serial number and all those things. And anything that's a Wolfsburg radio has to utilize a different program with it that we have to also help with that. But overall, this is a pretty good process. Now it changes a little bit. So there's some hurricanes we've had. I know Hurricane Florence, I think I arranged programming for 27 aircraft. And I always pop this picture up. The one on the bottom left is a picture of a Jayhawk that is sitting in a field next to a hospital here in Greenville, North Carolina. And the reason why it was sitting here is because that came from maybe New Orleans, or it was another air station. They flew right into the state. There were still rescues going on, and they needed to be loaded. And so they flew here. I met them there, walked out. They stayed hot. We loaded in. I gave them a real quick brief, and they took off and went to work. And that's really cool. However, that's not ideal. So what we don't want is to get behind the game. So what we try to do is, if we know a storm is coming or some type of event we have notice, is we start working with these air assets that are going to be coming in, and we try to get this stuff loaded before they get here. So during, I believe maybe it was Hurricane Matthew, Atlantic City, Detroit, Savannah, Clearwater, and there was some more. We worked with all those air stations and all their avionics guys and had everything pushed out to them before the aircraft even left their air stations to come work here. And it was fantastic. Like, as soon as they got here, they're ready to work. And there's a lot of logistics. If you see the top left, there's a helipod or a helibase set up, and all these aircraft come in. It's really difficult to try to do radio programming on the flight line in that type of environment. You got to have power. Sometimes loading of the aircraft don't go right. God forbid something goes wrong and you brick a radio and something goes wrong. So we try to get all this done ahead of time. Can we do that? Can we get 20 aircraft coming in North Carolina and load them up when they get here? Yes, but we don't want to. Yeah, and these were some of the lessons learned. Pretty much what I just covered. This picture that you see here on the right was a picture I took, and it was at Coast Guard Air Station Elizabeth City, and this was me trying to assist them in the middle of a disaster to load the state trunked radio system. So we don't want to do that. That's we want the aircraft out working, And we want that stuff well coordinated ahead of time. And those are definitely some of the improvements we've made over time. And that is a 65 aircraft, so that's not even native here. So that, I believe that one came from Detroit, maybe. So very, very fun. All right, so this is probably one of the bigger takeaways if you're involved with air to ground communications, or even on the other thing I left out is there amateur radio loaded on board any of these aircraft? And that's a really good question. And the answer is yes. We have them loaded on the Blackhawks in North Carolina, and we do not have them on any of the Coast Guard aircraft. It's a little more complicated, but some of these aircraft, yes, have amateur radio resources loaded. And you say, well, how can they do that? That's all sorts against gray area. Well, the question I have is it? And if we're in a disaster setting and infrastructure is broken, and the only thing working happens to be a VHF or UHF amateur radio repeater, you know what? We're going to use it, and we'll iron out the rest later. And that may sit uneasy with some people, but the deal is always go back to life safety, incident stabilization, property conservation. Is if there's a life at stake and it's the only option available, I don't care what it is, use it, and we'll figure it out later. So that's, yes, there are some resources most of them are like simplex, national call, and some aircraft do have some specific to, like our medical aircraft have radio repeaters that are in this region that in the event that was the last ditch effort, they could use it. And some people are amateur radio operators on board the aircraft as well. But so what you see here is what we call an air to ground block card. And when we get a really big disaster, this is the type of card we hand out. And so we look at the aircraft. Does it have these resources on board? It don't have to have all of them. Does it have any of them? So is it 7, 8, U, V, Marine, UHF, VHF, HF? And the answer is yes. So it's almost like a yes/no box. So aircraft, what do you have? Okay, HF, yes. Okay, ground, what do you have? Oh, HF, good. That's a common thing, or a common mode between you all, common frequency. That's going to be one of your options. So we'll just do a normal pace plan, a primary, an alternate, a contingent, and a backup or an emergency. And that's how we do this. And that's how we coordinate air to ground. And when you look at all the ground resources that come in, so, we saw the Cajun Navy. That was one group we saw a lot during a lot of these hurricanes. And well, what are they using on the ground? And the answer is it depends. What's working? And so if they show up with some type of radio, how do we integrate that? Are they using GMRS, FRS? I mean, who knows? So we try to come up with every option, even if it's a simple Marine channel. It could be AM air. And we really try to refrain from using AM air for a variety of reasons, but that is an option. If that's the last ditch effort, and I know that aircraft has an AM air radio, and I have an AM radio, and we have nothing else to communicate with, we're going to use it. But that has to be coordinated. So you send all these aircraft out, you got people on the ground. How do you make that work? What channel or frequency we're using? So that's where these cards come in. And we design these for geographic areas. So the northeast part of the state, you're going to be block 1. Down here, you're going to be block 2. And that works very well for that. Overall, we haven't had to use this because Viper has worked well for us over the last really 20 years that I've been engaged with emergency services. All right, so PACE plan. Those of you that are not familiar, almost everything, a PACE plan, if you have a PACE plan for everything you do in life, you should be pretty successful. So, what's plan A, B, C, and D? So here, obviously primary, we're going to use Viper. It's the easiest thing, and it's the clearest and works the best overall daily. The next thing we may go to some type of conventional option. We have 700 air to ground frequencies that are part of the NPA, National Public Safety lineup, and then of course AM air to ground. What I want to point out though is at the top, things are normal, but they're a little more complicated. So we talked about the IDs and all the things we got to load, and you got to have a good tower signal and all this other things. And then we go all the way to the bottom where things are bad. And the moral of the story is, as things get bad, the simpler technology has to get. And that's a good, not just this, but when you're doing general MCOM stuff, is as the incident grows or gets worse, advances, technology needs to start going the opposite direction. And most of the time it's forced that way. Remember, so, a PACE plan is not a channel plan. It's not an ICS 205. It's simply just technology, of what you're going to use as the next step. And you can take this a lot further. Is you can say, what are your trigger points? So if my primary doesn't work, or even the primary system, is everybody trained to use it? Do I need to provide any instruction? What is the trigger point to move to the next step? And what time does it take the next step to be implemented? So you can take this PACE plan and really dig down in the weeds with how do you know to move to the next alternate? Is it 5 minutes with no communications? Could be all sorts of different things. And this is just one of the, I think this is the last slide. I don't know if there's anybody on here that does any of this type work, but we've learned a lot from doing this, and other states have learned, and we've shared with them things that have been successful with us and things that have been a problem. And here's just a list of them. And these are specific things as it relates to programming in specifically P25 and in the trunked environment. And yeah, so that being said, I'm willing to answer any questions. I appreciate your time listening. This is a very interesting topic. It's something that probably, most people don't discuss on a regular basis, but how to air assets communicate with the ground, especially in disaster scenarios. And hopefully this gave you a little bit of understanding of where local, regional, and state resources are planning and putting their effort to get this accomplished and ensure everybody on the ground is safe and taken care of. That's all I got. Go ahead, Dan.
It helps when I unmute, Sorry about that. Great presentation. You want to lower your desktop?
Yes, absolutely. Let me do that there.
All right. There's a bunch of things in chat. Let's see. Anybody got their hands up yet? Nobody's got their hands up. Do you see chat there?
Yep. So let me go up here to let me get up to the top here. Let's see. I don't need to read any direct messages. We'll keep going. We are seeing a preventer. Okay, good. Yep. Hopefully we got that straight. Yeah, I wasn't paying attention to the chat. You'll have to bear with me on that.
Not a problem.
Yeah, North Carolina, it's debatable. I can't remember where the largest. I know we're in the top. We're in the top 3 or 4, but Steve says we're the largest. But we're definitely one of the larger trunk systems in the nation. Yes, PSAPs. If people didn't know what PSAPs are, those are essentially 911 centers where that field those calls. What basis does Motorola charge for usage? That's a great question. So Motorola really, for the most part, doesn't have anything to do except with the system design. Most states, have some of them have user fees and other type fees, but North Carolina, no fee to use the system. So if you're a PSAP or a 911 center that's tied directly into the core, you have to keep all those connections and the firmware of all that stuff up to what the state has. But as an end user, and it's only open to emergency services. So, fire, law, EMS, and there's tons of other ones, obviously military, and I could probably go on a list of 50, but it's funded by grant money. And so in North Carolina, we're one of a few that do not charge a subscriber fee to the end user, which is really good. We're very thankful for what North Carolina has. How do they get counties to comply? Comply. So Barry, comply with what? All right, we'll keep moving. Yeah. How do they get to comply? The only thing they have to comply with is that mandatory template of what they load in the radios. So that's the baseline, what they have to have, but the rest of it is rather voluntary. Turned down a P25 system some number of years ago because the cost was prohibitive. Yeah, well, like anything, cost is a real, none of this is cheap anymore. The way I equate it though is, if a radio costs $5,000, that's a pretty important piece of equipment, and you use that for every single call you go on. We're not running a defibrillator on an ambulance that's 15 years old. That technology's changed, and defibrillators now are $30,000. So like everything, things have gotten crazy expensive, and yes, yeah. Okay. Can a single stuck mic type a statewide talk group? Yeah, great question. The answer is most of the time, no. Most of the radios are programmed with a timeout timer, and those can go off. But in the event we do have some type of offender like that, whether it's intentional or accident, we can easily call up to the network operations center and report the ID and have that ID disabled. Best approach to reading the aux fog and NIFOG. Day reading, bedtime? Oh, I don't know. That depends how interested you are. I wouldn't read it regularly, but I would keep it as a reference. Know where things are in it. And if somebody says, well, what are 8-call or 8-tax, or if you take the AUXCOM class and you're making a 205 and you're integrating with public safety, or you're helping your local EOC, emergency management, when they're talking the language, that you have some idea of what those things are. Interesting, in North Carolina, we use AUXCOM personnel for really many tasks, and they're rados, they're operating radios, they're operating Viper radios, satellite telephones, they're doing it all. So having that knowledge of what the public safety side of the house is pretty important. All right, let's see. Example of backhaul issues. Yeah, lots of backhaul issues. So if we get Backhoe Joe decides to take his excavator and rip up a fiber line out of the ground, everybody on the presentation probably has outages and things they see from a day-to-day basis. And as much as we like to say we have redundancy and things running in loops and rings and all, we look at the Nashville bombing, don't have time to talk about it, but how one central spot, and look what happened. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of places like that, and it happens. We had a car hit a telephone pole at an intersection, and it took out connection to 4 911 centers. How does that happen? That shouldn't happen in today's world. So yes, that does happen. A lot of radio system sites are backhauled on fiber, and so those are lease lines. And like I said, anything can go wrong, and it depends how resilient that system is designed on. Whether it can heal itself, or it goes into site trunking or other forms. Drones, that's a good one. Yeah, that is a big issue. I'm not quite sure how to address it, but drones are a challenge. So not only are they being used by emergency services agencies that are totally credentialed and able to use them, but then we have to deal with everybody that's bought something off eBay and is just out there to take some pictures and have fun. It's a big challenge. So, obviously, whenever there's a disaster area or a national security event, or there's a gathering really over 30,000 people, you'll see what they call a notice to airmen issued. And that is nobody can fly in that area unless you've been given strict approval to do so. And that gets that's a deep conversation, but there are some things out there. But and the state and national level government has some tools to handle some of those things if they get in the way. All right, yes, eNIFOG is an app. Put it on your phone. Look at it instead of playing solitaire. Man, that's good. Yeah, true. Yes, but yeah, those are all. A lot of these things are digital format now, and you can look at them, and the AUXFOG. I mean, get the AUXFOG as well. That's another good. The other thing is a lot of states have their fogs or field operation guides that are actually, some of them are available online and in open source, and some of them are secure. But you may want to look to see if your state has that. And I want to point out, I don't have. Oh, yeah, I do here. So here's the NIFOG 2.0 right here. And you would say, oh, it's just public safety in here, but no, there's a lot of amateur radio things in here as well. And of course, I know it's in the back, but I probably can't put my hands on it. But in the back, there's a lot of stuff: amateur radio, national calling frequencies, all your band plan, all that stuff is in that as well. So, yep. All right. Any other questions?
Just to comment, latest NIFOG seems to have a good bit of ITSL data and how-to stuff in it, which you can't avoid networking these days.
No, you're right. And actually, the new NIFOG is fantastic. And the only complaint I have about it is that there's not enough hard copies going around. But in today's so here's band plan. But in today's digital world, having it on your smart device or your computer, laptop, or anything you're using is honestly probably the best place. But yeah. Yep.
Okay, Victor, you got your hand up, sir. Victor.
Good evening and thank you. Great program, great presentation. You mentioned earlier, you showed that slide about the flooding, that 10 feet or 20 feet deep. And, it strikes me, to flood to that depth, you must be covering a large area, which means a lot of flight time, in and out resources. Coordinating that must be a nightmare. And my first part of the question is, what's flight time on a mission like that? Is it a half hour each way, or is it just a 10-minute run? And then who's actually controlling the flight? Is it a local air traffic station, flight service station, or the pilots themselves negotiating how they're going to fly in and out on, if they've got 10 houses within a block area, a quarter-mile area, how they're going to manage that airspace?
Yeah, that's a fantastic. Actually, that's a whole bunch of really good questions there. I'm going to try to make sure I try to remember to hit them all. So where is that? So flight time. Let's talk about that first. So it depends on the aircraft. So, and what they're carrying. So if you look at some of those lighter aircraft, I'm not totally familiar with burn time on, but they're usually carrying a hoist operator, a pilot, co-pilot, it could be 3 or 4 up there. And it depends where they're stationed. So a lot of times what we'll do is a hurricane comes here, a lot of the aircraft will get out of here and they'll go west to the central part of the state and shelter in place. And then after the storm passes, then they'll start coming back and locating towards the east. But some of them will be out flying for hours. So those the U.S. Coast Guard aircraft, the Jayhawks, they cost about 10,000 hours or $10,000 an hour to run, and they can fly for hours. But most of the time, what they're doing is they're picking people up, and they're just what we call lily padding them, or they're bringing them over to a safe area, dropping them down where somebody on the ground can get to them, and then take them where they need to go. There's not a lot of long haul type stuff, but where you see that is the interfacility transport. So once the rescues die down, the medical business is still happening. So somebody's still having a heart attack or having a baby or needs to go to a burn center. So there's where those longer transport times come in. Who's coordinating it? So we have the air boss and the air cell. Once it is that type of environment, that's the overall command and coordination of that operation. But the air traffic is still being coordinated by the local air traffic control, what airspace they're in. And of course, you mentioned flight service station, all that. And most of the time when a disaster happens and we have people being rescued, like I said, that NOTAM comes into play, and you don't see civilian aircraft causing much of a problem. But the air side of the house, they produce a document, much like if you've taken ICS classes, it's much like an incident action plan, and they call it different things. One of them is it's a SPINS document, and I have to go back to what it stands for, but that document is really a tactical or incident action plan strictly for the air side on how they're going to deconflict, where the fuel is, where the helipads are, hospitals, all that type stuff. So pretty neat document.
Hey, thank you, Victor. That's some good questions there. Anybody else put your hand up or put something in the chat?
Well, hopefully it was interesting. When hurricane season comes around, or there's a natural disaster, you could kind of look back on some of this stuff and see the rationale when you see, big flooding events and helicopters doing hoists, kind of what's going on in the background. So it takes a tremendous team to make all that happen.
Is there a call out sequence? In other words, depending upon how big the disaster is, first time guys would probably be the guys that do that kind of stuff all the time. One like Coast Guard, whoever. As they run thin of manpower or aircraft, do they go to the next level with people who don't do it as often? How do they work that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to be honest with you. The Coast Guard really take charge, and you'll find an event that happens or impacts a state, they will bring in assets from really half the country and focus in on that area. So I have not seen them run thin on manpower. So that's on the air side. On the ground side, they bring in these swift water teams and what they call, what is it? It's a water team, really nothing more than a small John boat, and they walk from house to house, get people out that need it. And sometimes those are, they don't have enough of those guys. But the air side, Coast Guard does a fantastic job. I'm gonna be honest with you. I can't say enough. Very professional, and they just get the job done.
Very good. Okay, any more questions out there? I don't see any hands up, nothing new in chat. That being the case, we've gone over a little bit, but that's okay. It's been a great presentation, and I appreciate you doing that.